Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, the 2019 edition, brought to you in partnership with our gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and hitting the happy subscribe button. I think it's happy. You can follow ID24Conf on Twitter. And if you have questions for our presenter, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag. We will ask them at the end of the session. A reminder to everybody listening, ID24 is a respectful community with a code of conduct. You can see that code of conduct at inclusivedesign24.org, and the code of conduct is linked in the footer. Also, a hello to everyone who is joining us live from around the world. I understand we have people from Paris, Edinburgh, Yorkshire, and Hyderabad.
I also want to give a special shout out to the community at React Edinburgh. I'll be speaking there tonight about accessibility, so I'm hoping you're tuning in to ID24 and enjoying these talks. Next up, we have Eleni Beveratu, who will be talking about accessibility in type and typesetting. Over to you, Eleni.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for having me over in this really great initiative. Hello, everyone. So my name is Eleni Beveratu, and I'm creative director at Dalton Mag, a typeface design studio based in London, precisely in Brixton, which is a very loud and noisy neighborhood. So if you hear any background noises, as you might be able to be hearing now, I apologize for that. So today I wanted to talk to you about accessibility in type and typesetting because I believe that a good accessibility is important as it helps you to clearly communicate, it avoids confusion, and it also adheres to legal regulations, which sometimes we might be forgetting that we actually have to follow some things. My personal passion about accessibility started many years ago, but the topic of accessibility and type became an interest of mine when I was doing my master's degree in Reading in type design. And at the time I had gone to the doctor for something on my eye, and they had made a little treatment that meant that for a few hours I couldn't see very well. It happened that on the same day, in just a few hours, I had to go to the bank and sign some important papers. To my great surprise, when I actually arrived at the bank, I couldn't read anything of the papers I signed. Up to today, I'm not very sure if I actually put my signature in the correct place. So this is where a great alarm kind of rang for me, and it said that since I'm a designer, since I care about accessibility, I should try and understand a little bit more how I can bring that element into my work. So today I wanted to talk to you about a lot of the guidelines that one can find out there about good accessibility in type and typesetting. And when one does basic research on the internet, they will find the first PDFs that show up come up with some great words such as guidelines, minimum standards, golden rules. And to be honest, the sources are quite correct. And the words themselves sound compact, reassuring, and something that one should not question, something that one should just follow and make sure that, you know, they do what those guidelines say. However, I have found out that because those guidelines are oversimplifying things, and in the effort of kind of creating a rule for everyone, they very often do the exact opposite effect. For this talk, I am using some quotes that I had found in those three guidelines. So the first one is the ADA requirements, the American with Disability Act. The other one is the guideline from the UCAF, the UK Association for Accessible Formats, is the one that you can find from the RNIB as well. And the EBU one, which is the one that is created by the European Blind Union. Before I dive into the actual presentation, I wanted to give two definitions because I think some terminology can be a little bit confusing at times. So there's a difference between clear print and large print. Clear print is any printed material that is created as to be accessible by everyone. It's basically when you create a document that follows standards that can fit everyone. And large print are specific printed documents that are created for the visually impaired. Another important definition is the difference between legibility and readability. It's two words that are oftenly confused and mistaken. Legibility is how fast we can understand a letter, so how fast we can read that an A is an A, an E is an E, and O is an O. And readability is how fast we can read an entire text. Today I want to talk about three things: legibility, readability, and likability. And I will start with the legibility part. So if you look at this slide at a glance, do you read burn or do you read bum? Or some other examples, do you read clear or do you read dear, or CS5 or CSS? There's every day in our reading, during our reading process, we sometimes stumble across those misleading words, or like words that look similar. Moreover, sometimes some typefaces really don't make it easy for you to understand what the difference is between each word. So for example, here it could be Henry 3 or Henry Ill or Henry 111. And this one, I find it quite funny because I think once you see it, you can't unsee it. I think I read it first Isle of Cocoa, but one could also read it as Isle of Cow. Now, because it's within context, because it's in the Chanel brand, a very recognizable brand, people kind of guess what the word meant. However, when we read, we mainly, what happens is that we identify a word by its overall shape. So again, going back to my first example, the reason why we get to confuse this is because the overall outline is very, very similar. And you can see it when there is an absence of letters. Therefore, when there is no context, or when the letters are standing alone, they can become a little bit more confusing. Very good examples are the uppercase D with the uppercase O, or the single story A that you can find on the 6th line with a lowercase o, an I with a J, a very simplified J. And when those words are out of context, actually, this is where we start having problems. So this player could have really a lot of names. It's really hard to understand what his t-shirt is saying. And I feel a little bit for Fred, because I reckon that he's struggling every time that he's putting down his passport number. I think it's a bit hard to understand whether the O, whether it's a 0 or whether it's an O. And you can see that quite clearly on the date part, which you can see here, where the 0 of the 05 and October, the O from October are exactly the same. Same width, same size, same weight. So how do we know what to choose? What is more legible? What is more readable? Well, first we need to understand how we actually read. So when we learn how to read, when we are at school and we learn how to read, we read letter by letter. But as we become more proficient in reading, what we do is that we actually start doing jumps, which we call saccadic movements. When we do those jumps, we jump between 7 and 9 letters, and our eyes fixate on that letter. And once they have fixated, they start taking a few pictures, like they start reading 3 to 4 letters on the left and 3 to 4 letters on the right. And this is how we form the overall image of the words in our brain. So the clearer this image is, the faster our brain will create the word that we are reading. And you can see here 2 examples. On the top, we have Helvetica, and on the bottom, it's another typeface that is a lot more open. And you can see that in the top one, already some words become really hard to instantly recognize. So the word read or the word line are a lot more recognizable on the bottom part. And that is for various reasons, and I'm gonna explain. So going back to those accessibility guidelines that we can find online, they often have quotes such as use legible typefaces such as Arial, or choose standard fonts with easily recognizable upper and lowercase characters. Without serif, sans serif, Arial, Verdana, Helvetica are good choices. Before I actually show you some visual examples, I wanted to stop in a technicality. And here it says choose standard fonts, and it says Arial, Verdana, Helvetica. Now, Helvetica is a standard font for Mac users, but it's not a standard font for PC users. And that is something that we really need to have in mind, that as designers, we might be mainly using Macs, and we might take for granted that what we see is what everyone sees, but actually that's not the reality. So that's just a small technicality, but something to bear in mind. What is a standard font is not exactly the same for everyone. But actually moving on the design of Arial per se, Arial is really not a good design for accessibility. And based on the principle that I explained to you before about how we read, you can really see this here. So if you look at the C, the counters are very, very small. So it could look like an O, or the A, the E, the S. They are all closing way too much. So at small size, they can really get very confusing. Whereas on the bottom typeface, that is a lot more open, the C is harder to confuse this with an O. Same for the A, the E, and the S. Another thing to keep in mind is that the narrow characters of Arial, like the L, the F, and the T, are way too narrow. So one thing that we need to be careful of is to give a little bit more presence to those characters that overall don't have a lot of presence. So a good tactic is to find typefaces or to use typefaces that have those little tails on the L, or have F and T's that are a little bit more dominant. They create a better reading rhythm as well, and they also separate from each other. And one more topic to be quite aware of is how we actually recognize a letter. So when we read, we mainly read the top half of a letter, as you can see here. So if my Q, my A, and my G have the single story, one spectacle design, it's very hard to actually know what the letter is. On the other hand, if my A and my G have the more, the double story shapes, so the most complex ones, they are actually more legible. And this is something that we often confuse, because we think that having this A and this G is something quite confusing and creates a disruption in the text, but actually it really helps with legibility. And another thing that would have helped anybody that is using a lot of numbers and a lot of uppercase and lower cases together is to look for typefaces that overall have also differentiations in their heights. So here on the top, you can see that the I and the L are exactly the same height. The only difference that they have is that the L's are a little bit lighter than the I. Now that makes it extremely hard to recognize. Whereas on the bottom part, the L's are a little bit taller and they also have a little tail. So instantly you know that it's an I and two L's. The same happens with numbers. It's good to make sure that the numbers are also a little bit shorter. Again, they create better differentiation and instant recognition. And that the same thing could happen with a 0 and an O. You could have a 0 with a bar and an O that is a lot wider than the 0. And that brings me to my second part, which is about readability. Now, when it comes to readability, I do find that guides do a much better job. They mention a few things which I would like to go through. So the one is don't use italics, don't underline large blocks of capital letters. Don't underline things and don't use large blocks of capital letters. And those are all very valid points. The more complex you make the typesetting, the harder it is to understand things. Underlining underlining a sentence adds an extra stroke, which kind of creates more confusion. And capital letters tend to be very similar to each other. So you have the uppercase D, the uppercase O, you have the H, the I. There's not so much variety, so it's a lot harder to read. Use adequate line spacing and use adequate space between paragraphs. I have to say I quite like that those guidelines here don't use specific words, don't use specific measurements. They say use adequate. So it leaves it a little bit to your judgment, and I'll show you why it's actually quite important to not be that specific. Make sure that text is left aligned, except in exceptional circumstances. We learn in the Latin script, we have learned to read from left to right. So aligning on the left is only natural to our reading process. Use horizontal text. Vertical text is, again, very hard to navigate and follow. Words and single pieces of information are not split onto two lines unless unavoidable. So try to keep things as compact and like together as possible. And avoid using too many columns, or avoid to separate them way too little or way too much. And last but not least, use good contrast between your text and your background, because that's also very, very important. I had seen a very interesting talk about accessibility and colors, and they were saying that if you want to have a good contrast between your text and your background, use a ratio of 80 to 20%. So 80 being your text and 20 being your background. Again, those guidelines say a few things that are good when it comes to weight, and it's choose fonts with medium heaviness. Avoid fonts with light type with thin strokes, or one with a combined thin and heavy strokes. So what they're basically saying is that make sure that your typeface is as monolinear as possible. So where if you see here, the H is becoming a little bit thinner, but not as thin as it would be in Times New Roman, for example. So it's overall quite monolinear. It looks like one stroke. And the thickness of it is also quite strong and dominant. What's important is to not go very, very light or very, very dark. And you can see that as soon as I blur this image, you can see that the two first weights start to suffer, as well as the two bottom ones, for different reasons. The first two disappear, whereas the bottom two, they become almost like a black blob. And that can be problematic for when you read something very fast or from a distance, or if you have any reading, any visual impairment. However, one thing to keep in mind is that the word regular is not doesn't mean that it's not a unit of measure. So when you look at your fonts and you use the regular weight, it doesn't mean that it's always the same thickness. And you can see that here we have two different typefaces. The top one is a lot lighter than the bottom one. And if I take the two strokes and put them the one on top of the other, you will see the difference. So thickness is not the thickness. When you hear the word regulars, the thickness is not standard. It's a range of weights. So going back to what it was saying think of your background, think of the overall information that you have in your text, that you're typesetting. Choose the thickness that you find is more adequate. It's a range. Now here starts the big confusion, however. A lot of those guidelines, they talk about point sizes. They say for clear print, use 12-point sizes, or 14 is recommended. For large print, use 16 or 18-point is recommended. They say keep text in large font, preferably between 14, 16, or 18 points. Those guidelines, they do have some notes, however, which is the most important bit, if you ask me. But those notes come a little bit too late. They either come many, many pages later on or further down in the text, which means that the reader that is looking for basic guidelines will not pay attention to that. What those notes are really saying is that point size, again, is not a standard, it doesn't say that it's a standard height. So here you can see two typefaces, Palatino and Arial. They're typesetting the exact same point size, 280 point size, but one is significantly smaller than the other. So I would say never rely on the actual point size. Try to use more than 12 points for clear print. Try to use more than 16 points for large print, but use your judgment because some typefaces are smaller by default and some others are bigger by default. What really matters is not the point size, but the X height. So here you can see that the area that I've highlighted in red in the top typeface is relatively short compared to the cap height and the ascenders. Whereas on the bottom example, the area highlighted in red is overall closer in proportions with the capital letters and the ascenders. The closer those proportions are, that means that the X height is larger, and that means that in smaller sizes, they will look bigger. And lastly, when we're talking about readability in those guidelines, I found that letter spacing is potentially one of the most confusing matters. This is my favorite sentence. It says, use monospaced letter type. This means that each letter is separated by exactly the same small distance from the other letter in a word, while there is more space between words. This makes reading easier for partially sighted person. Now, that's interesting because the terminology of this sentence is wrong 3 times. So I tried to make a little mock-up of what this sentence was saying. So it says use monospace, which is the top one, because monospace typefaces are divided by the same amount of white space. But that's not true, because if you look at the top part, the space between the U and the H is a lot bigger than the space between the 2 M's. I think at the first glance, anyone can understand that a monospace typeface is actually extremely illegible. And that is because what happens is in a monospace typeface, you have a specific box and you have to fit the design of the letter within that box. So the wide letters like the M become very, very squeezed compared to more narrow letters like the A or the D, which have a lot more width to play with. So then the same sentence that we read before, what it says is that, so I reckon they didn't mean to say monospace. What they were trying to say is use typefaces that have the exact same distance of spacing between each letter. And they absolutely say do not use proportional space. They reckon this is something wrong. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about spacing and why using the second example is also not good. But before I do that, I wanted to read to you the quote that I found from the ADA requirements, which I found extremely entertaining. It's very long, and I actually tried to replicate what it was saying, but it took me way too long to put that in a visual. I find it extremely hard to understand. So it says, character spacing shall be measured between the 2 closest points of adjacent raised characters within a message, excluding word spaces. Where characters have rectangular cross sections, spacing between individual raised characters shall be an 1/8 inch, 3.2 millimeters minimum, and 4 times the raised character stroke width maximum. Where characters have other cross sections, spacing between individual raised characters shall be as 1/6 of an inch, 1.6 millimeter minimum, and 4 times the raised character stroke width maximum at the base of the cross section, and an 1/8 inch, 3.2 millimeters minimum, and 4 times the raised character stroke with width maximum at the top of the cross section. Oof, I lost my breath reading this, and I'm still very unsure of what it means. Long story short, when we're talking about spacing, nobody is spacing by measuring things in comparison to other things. This is not the way to measure. And you will see this in those examples. So think of letters as shapes. Those shapes are spaced by always leaving the same amount of gap between each them on their extremities, as you can see here. The problem by doing that is that actually the white gap on this second white space looks a lot bigger than the white gap on the first or the third one. So what one needs to do if you want this to look correctly is that actually you need to space tighter letters that have more open shapes than letters that are more blocky like a square, as you can see on the second example. That really helps into creating a more balanced and correct rhythm when reading. So think of spacing as a liquid. If you have a glass with a liquid and you pour it outside, it fills in the gaps. And if you had the same glass with the same amount of liquid, it should kind of, when you pour it, it should also fill the inner parts of the letter. So the lighter your typeface is, the bigger the gap between the letters should be because of that ratio of the inner white space with the outer white space. The darker your typeface is, the smaller the white space, so the counters of the letters are, and hence the spacing should also be tighter. So in order to achieve a good spacing result, you actually need to, as I said before, space some shapes tighter than others. So it's not about measuring exact distances between letters. And this you can see an example of the top part, the top typeface being a little bit tightly spaced. So the outer shape of the letter looks a little bit narrow compared to the inner shape of the letter. Whereas on the bottom example, the outer shape of the letter is a lot more balanced with what's happening on the inside. So forget about measuring, about doing percentages, about putting little boxes between the one end of a letter and the beginning of another. Look at it visually and try to understand which letters are more open and have more white space than the others and balance that accordingly. What I found interesting is that often people start to track typefaces. And this on the top example, you can see that the spacing has been way too open, whereas on the bottom example, the spacing is way too tight. Both extremes being bad for legibility, for readability, excuse me, because what they create is that the first one, you read less fast, because when your eyes do those saccadic movements that we talked about earlier, they land in fewer letters. Whereas on the bottom one, within a saccadic movement, your brain reads more letters. And as a result, your brain has to process more than it's actually meant to. Most of those guidelines don't mention anything about proportions. And I thought I'll give you my take on this, because I think it's equally important as the height, the size of the letters, and the spacing. Most of them don't talk about the width of those letters. So typefaces can go from very condensed to very expanded. When you look to use a typeface for good legibility, look for something in the regular range. So here. However, bear in mind that, again, the word regular doesn't mean it's a standard width. So here you can see 5 different typefaces, and the very top one, Calmetta, that's the regular weight in the regular width. And on the bottom one, you see Objective on its regular weight and regular width. And you can see that the 2 widths are actually very different. So always aim for something that looks more like those 2 that are highlighted here, Active and Venn, which are more, I want to say normal proportions, but more standardized, not too narrow, not too extended. So now we'll go to my last section, which is likability. While the first 2, legibility and readability, are part of accessibility that one can measure, one can do research on and come up with best practices, likability is something that is not that tangible, not that easy to put into like a category. However, I found it equally important, if not more. So again, going back to those guidelines, they often say use typefaces without serifs, sans serifs. That, according to those guidelines, good legibility and readability only comes in sans serif typefaces. However, every research that has been done is proving that serifs are not making a great difference in legibility and readability. If anything, there are pros and cons on both, because indeed the sans serif typeface is more simple because it doesn't have a lot of details. Hence, one could say it's clearer to read. On the other hand, a serif typeface has a lot more details, which makes the recognition of the letter a lot faster and easier. And hence, one could argue that actually it's making the reading process a lot faster and better. I think this is where likability is very important, is that we are used to read sans serif on screens. That's due for historical reasons. This is when computers came into place, they were not as of high resolution as they are now. So having a serif typeface would create a lot of ambiguity because there were not enough pixels to play with, where sans serif would be a lot easier. On the other hand, on printed materials like newspapers or books, one is more used to see serif typefaces. At the end of the day, we read better what we read the most. And I think this is an example of likability playing a part on that. The other thing we shouldn't forget, and in this talk, I mainly focused on how readers, Latin readers read. That's for two reasons. Well, for the main reason is that most of the research has been done using the Latin script and specifically in the English language. However, most of those principles apply also to different scripts. Yet we need to be very careful that often in other scripts, some other preferences and likability matters play a role in this accessibility topic. So this is Thai is a good example where Thai readers, older generations, are more used to read the looped Thai, so the top part, whereas younger generations are more used to read the loopless style of the Thai. So what do you do when you create a document that should be accessible for everyone? Which age group, which age group would you prioritize? That's an interesting point that I found, that most of the designers, so most of the people that create those materials, are between 20 and 35 years old. So looking back at that example of the Thai readers, where those people, the creators of those documents will have a different, I'm very sorry for this sound. The creators of the document will have a different likability in terms of which style to use, but moreover, they actually won't have started yet with any of the visual problems that one might have, because presbyopia doesn't kick in until you're 40. So I think that's something we need to be really aware of, that as designers, we need to think of who we are designing for, what are their values, what are their cultures, what is their age, and not just design something that looks good to us. To end on a positive note, NASA is doing it really well with their typography documentation that they have put together. I quite like it because they also give a little bit of background and research and understanding. And recently I found that the RGD released this very, very good document. And I particularly like it because it's one of the few documents that doesn't say use this at that point or use exactly this weight or this style. It explains again what are the best practices and what's good to follow. So all in all, what you need to think about is the font size, the line spacing, the hierarchy, the color contrast, font variation, content width, paragraph alignment, and to consider your audience, to follow typographic standards, but please, please question them. Do understand where they're coming from, what they really meant when they were written. And at the end of the day, it's all common sense, so just follow it. And thank you very much.
Thank you. That was awesome. As we talked a little bit about before the session, I'm a bit of a typography nerd, so I was very much looking forward to this session. Kathleen, do we have any questions?
Yes, actually, I have one of my own questions that I've been wondering about for a while, and I think you can possibly answer this, Eleni. You were mentioning the importance of X height for legibility in your typography. So I've in my accessibility lives, I have experienced, I've seen some designs where, like say a designer will use the rationale that using that more of the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law for some of these success criteria. So for example, this individual had a phrase, they were designing a badge, and they had a phrase that the font size was, and they were trying to meet contrast minimums for that 4.5 to 1, and the font size was smaller than 14 points bold. The font size was maybe 11 points bold, but what their rationale was they used all capital letters in this short phrase, and what they stated was, well, the height of these capital letters meets the exact X height of like a 19-point font of all lowercase letters. So is that more of that questioning the typography standards and following that, the guidelines of the importance of the X height? I don't know if that makes sense, but there was a big debate on this.
Yeah, it does. I think there are a few points there. Is that when you use all caps, they are by default taller than lower cases, right? So as you rightly said, it's fine to have it smaller because they will start being legible from a smaller point size, if that makes sense.
Yes.
As I showed before, using all caps can also decrease legibility because capital letters don't have that many details and so many refinement as to be able to depict each letter faster.
That's a very good point. It's more of it's a give and take, and it's very
you lose
careful.
Something, you win something else. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
To be honest with you, if it's only a short sentence or if it's only just a few words, it's fine to have it in all caps. If it's just, like a title, that's okay. I think the problem starts if you are typesetting a whole paragraph. So for a pin, it could be fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really great to have that debate settled. And that's excellent information. I think there was one more question, and I believe Adrian has this one. I'm going to scan the channel too as well.
I do indeed have a question, and I have opinions on this which are completely irrelevant. I am curious, Eleni, if you have any opinions or information, I guess opinions or data on typefaces specifically designed for dyslexia.
Oof, that's an interesting topic. And my short answer will be no. My longer answer will be that I don't think that such typefaces are good. I don't think that one can say this typeface cures dyslexia or this typeface cures macular degeneration. You can't say that because also, as we have seen, is that with all those things, each person, even if they are dyslexic, they will be, it's not the same level or it's not the same dyslexia from person to person, right? So I personally don't really believe in those typefaces that are kind of created for dyslexia, or there are other typefaces that are good for when you read, for your memory remembers them better. I found those to be a little bit gimmicky and promotional statements, if you ask me. If you follow all those good readability standards that I said in the beginning, like having open counters, like the C, the A, the E to be open, the tails on the L to be, to be there, and the F and the T to be more prominent, or even the dots on the I to be a little bit further than your, than your stem. This is where you actually tick most of the boxes. I think everything else that we push boundaries more, I personally question quite a lot of it.
All right. I appreciate that answer. And I understand that there's that line to walk between some people might find it helpful and yet. So I appreciate that, that realistic perspective. Kathleen, did we see any other questions come in?
So far, no. There is one other question I was curious about. You posted at the beginning of your talk 3D PDFs about some typography guidelines, one from the ADA, one from the UK, one from the EU that you reference. Do you find any distinct differences between the three?
No. No, to be honest. I think, all three of them are good in some parts and all three of them make mistakes in others. Well, the ADA requirements are legal requirements that one has to follow. The other two are more best practices. But no, I don't think they're very, very different all in all, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yes, that's very clear. It's nice to have a combination of three to reference. Yeah,
I do find the last one that I showed about that was made by the RGD to be my favorite of all.
Nice.
Yeah.
Notorious RGD. Okay. In that case, I'm going to wrap us up here. Eleni, thank you very much. That was a great talk. I saw a few type nerds on the Twitter who were very excited about it. So we were not the only ones. That's for
perfect. Sure. Well, thank you very much. I apologize for the noise that just stopped, of course.
Well, I think they were waiting for you.
Yes, I think so too.
The highest praise.
Well, enjoy the rest of the talk. I look forward to go to my desk and listen more about accessibility.
Thank you. I look forward to doing that too. For our listeners, if you like this session, hit the YouTube like button. It wants to be pressed. And don't forget, you can subscribe to youtube.com Inclusive Design 24 for future notifications. Also, a reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia, our silver sponsors, Adobe and SiteImprove, and our bronze supporters, Samsung Internet, DQ Systems, and the Paciello Group. And it's all captioned by MyClearText. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour, and we will be hearing Sam Latif present on the subject of disability. So take this opportunity to get a refill on your coffee or whatever your drink is at your time of day. And we will see you in, 17 minutes. Thank you again. Cheers.